Hi, I'm Caroline Rubach, Senior Associate at Diversa Partners, and this is State of Talent in another chapter in our series on climate careers. Today we have with us John Kim, founder and managing partner of thesis-driven venture capital firm Amasia. Amasia is currently focused on investing in founders who are fighting the climate crisis and enhancing sustainability through behavior change. John has a fascinating background, and we're excited to get into his story and insights and learning more about what drives him and what he does. And with me again is Jack Dunn, a San Francisco-based partner at Diversa, who's leading much of our work in climate tech, particularly across software, marketplaces, and frontier technology. So John, thanks so much for agreeing to come on.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for having me and Jack, and really appreciate the opportunity. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's great to see you again, John. I know you and Caroline have a somewhat long-standing relationship. I've I've been fascinated reading about you the last few days, and when we first connected, uh, just in how much your childhood and your values drives your approach to investing. I'm sure it does for many investors, but I think you are particularly forthcoming about that. So if you're comfortable with it, I'd love to just start with that. Like, tell us a little bit about how you grew up, and I think that'll prompt some natural questions into your story here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jack. Totally comfortable to share, I think I believe in getting vulnerable. I think that's how you connect with other people. So, I grew up in a little suburb outside of Boston. Boston is not known to be the most inclusive place, and I think I experienced that growing up. My parents were immigrants. I was one of very few minorities in my town. I got bullied and felt very much sort of othered, and just wanted so badly to be accepted by my peers. By the time I was 10, I was having suicidal thoughts. And, but by the time I was sort of 13, I kind of started to rebel like a lot of other kids do. But what I realized as I did that is that my peers started to respect me. And I thought, wow, this is really easy. So let me double down on this strategy. And I got into a lot of trouble, was arrested a few times, and had all sorts of issues. Um, and, I kind of, in those sort of 11 years from 13 to let's call it 24 or so, sort of rejected my identity, my roots. For me, that was three things. And these were the three things that were sort of the basis of why I was othered and bullied. And those were my family, my faith, and my culture. So the fact that my parents were outsiders, they weren't involved and engaged with the community. Um, they were Korean, obviously. Everyone else in my town was Irish or Italian. And because of that, they went to one of two Catholic churches in the town, and we went to a Korean Protestant church 30 minutes away. So these are all reasons why I was different. Um, and, where a lot of my pain came from. And so, in that sort of period of wandering, I think I got pretty okay at getting folks to accept me. But, uh, you know, there are a few different instruments that I use to do that. And I use that word kind of somewhat tongue in cheek. Music was one of those. And you'll see sort of later that that's something that I ended up, doing quite a bit of. Uh, and drugs was another one. I used to sell drugs. And, when you're sort of the guy bringing the party to the party, it does something for your sense of acceptance and respect. And same thing, when you're playing on stage for thousands of fans, they're screaming and you have people following you from city to city and groupies and all that. It also does something for your sense of acceptance and respect. But, um, I kind of realized at a certain point that with each of these higher highs, I felt a lower low. And one of the things that I studied in school, I was a psychology minor with a focus on cognitive science, and I was really fascinated by people and sort of the mind. And I realized that we're not really after praise from people or money or these worldly stimuli. we're after the little squirt of dopamine that comes when we get those things. And because we're adaptive mechanisms, we need more of that stimuli to get the same squirt of dopamine, which just puts you on this treadmill of, never ending hunger. And so it just felt very meaningless to me. And I got pretty depressed. And there was one show in particular where I was looking out at the crowd, and I heard a voice say, "Come home." And I was very confused by what that meant. But I kind of realized that in that context, home wasn't a physical place, but it was sort of my state of mind, those three things that I felt I was getting bullied for. So I decided to sort of up and reconnect with my culture, my family, and my faith. So I moved to Korea and all those things. So I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but yeah, there was a lot of pain. And it sort of led me to a very sort of diverse, a long period of wandering, and then coming back to my roots in a sense.
Really fascinating. And not to divert from your story, but tell us about, I know that connection to Korea has been a major thing for you, and it seems like it's evolved along a lot of different tracks. Would you be willing to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, first thing I'll say is, I wish I grew up now, right, with K-pop and all this stuff. I mean, it's so cool to be cool.
That's such a funny point.
I went to a BTS concert last year. It was just insane. Like all the people that were there, and a lot of them not even Korean. But yeah, for me, moving to Korea, I guess my parents had moved there when I went to college, so I had no desire at all to be in that place. It was the reason I got bullied, and there was something that happened very specific. It was during the World Cup. There was a game between Korea and the U.S., and I was visiting, and I kind of left the band. I was thinking about what to do, and there was a particular moment where I sort of made the decision to make that move. There was a soccer game that took place during the World Cup in 2002, and there was one sort of specific point in that game where there was a defender who was kicked in the head, and he fell to the ground, and he's bleeding profusely. And they had to carry him off on a stretcher. And everyone thought for sure this guy's out for the rest of the game. There's no way he can come back to play. And if you're aware of the history of Korea, it's a pretty small country that's been bullied by its neighbors, basically China and Japan, throughout its history. But something about that makes the Korean people really resilient. And so, after, I don't know, it was 10 minutes or something like that, the guy actually came back and started running onto the field with his head all bandaged up. Like you could hardly see his head. And in that moment, the place just like went nuts. And for the first time, I felt connected to that country. For me, being Korean, that's something, no, I don't want that. That's the reason I was rejected. So I reject Korea. Whenever I visited, Korea is a very homogenous place. So the fact that I was Korean American made me different already. They don't sort of accept you as such. So I just never really felt connected. But in that moment, it's like all the pain of thousands of years of Korean history just like ran onto that field. And I said, yes, I'm Korean. Like this is who I am. And this is all my pain. It just encapsulated everything that I had sort of gone through. For me, I think it's something that I came to embrace, unfortunately, in a way, kind of later in life. But, I think there are a lot of parallels. It kind of takes pain. I have this advisor who tells me your greatest pain becomes your greatest power. And I certainly think that everything Korea as a nation has been able to do has come from the fact that there's this incredible grit from all of the struggles that they've had to endure. And I think that, when I look back on my life, certainly, I think it would have been different if I didn't experience that pain. And so when I look at founders as well, and I think this might be what you're alluding to a little bit, I also look for the ability to deal with that struggle, because being a founder is really, really difficult. And that can come through sometimes episodes that one has dealt with in the past.
How do you think about, I I imagine that manifests sometimes as you're sort of looking at a founder and wondering where on the uh, resiliency and grit and hard nosedness and will to be accepted piece versus sort of actualized part of their journey they are, right? And there is probably some parts of the founder journey that are skewed towards you are likely to be more successful or more able to just continue on. Um, if you're still in maybe the earlier stages of dealing with some of that, right? Like how do you think about that when you meet a founder? And I know you only get a little sense of it, maybe especially in a first interaction, but like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's really a formula.
Yeah.
We do a lot of investing in internationally, and especially in Southeast Asia. So, our first investment that we made in the region was this company called Tokopedia, which ended up merged with another company and became the largest tech company in Indonesia, IPO for $30 billion last year. And when I met that founder, he hadn't, his name's William, he didn't come from a very strong, family background, which in business in places like Indonesia is very important, typically. He hadn't gone to one of the top schools. And yet he had been able to start this thing with less resource than all of his competitors. And it was sort of him, and there was this one other player called Lazada that were almost neck and neck in terms of their traction GMV, but Lazada had raised like something like $100 million and he had raised six. So just to see what he had done with such constraints, I just knew this guy was gonna fight to death and figure it out. Conversely, actually, our biggest miss in the region was this company called Grab, which is sort of like the Uber of Southeast Asia, and they do a lot of fintech and a strong sustainability angle as well. But we met Anthony pre-Series A, and he's still a friend of mine, and we kind of tell the story differently. But when he talks about it, like, oh yeah, I passed on you, and I'm like, no, I passed on you. I remember meeting him, and he comes from a very big business family in Malaysia, which is actually in the automotive industry, and so a lot of strategic benefit. But a lot of times, because entrepreneurship is so hard, if you have a lot of other options, people will just give up, right? And so I thought I had this sort of like bias in a way that if you have a lot of options, if you come from this big business family, you don't really need the money, you don't really have, you might be a little less likely to hustle. Maybe it's a little bit more questionable whether I should sort of bet on that or not. And so, what I didn't realize about Anthony is he's like literally on a mission from God. It's not about sort of, money for him. And he's also kind of like me, his faith drives a lot of his motivation. And so there's nothing like he's also going to fight to the death, but it's a totally different sort of reasoning and basis for that. So I wouldn't say there's a formula, but you can just kind of smell it, I think. And often it comes through narratives of how, people have gone through their lives. It's interesting. If you look at research on raising kids, I mean, every kid goes through pain. And so when a young child touches a light bulb, for instance, right, and it's painful, the natural parental reaction oftentimes is like, oh, bad light bulb, or don't talk about it. Like, don't think about the light bulb or whatever. But actually what they say, the best thing to do is talk about it, digest it, but let the kid and his brain associate a certain narrative as to what happened and why it happened and what the reaction is now and maybe what it should be and so on. And so that process of narrative association to the pain is the really important thing, I think, that makes someone resilient or not. Everybody's gone through pain, whether obviously varying degrees of it, but I think how that is interpreted is really what drives the ability to deal with a lot more pain or not.
John, I have a question. So on that thread of founders and advice that you might have for them, or what you're looking for when you're talking to founders. I was recently reading this really moving tribute that you wrote to your father, or about your father's legacy, with the virtue of patience and what he passed on to you there. And I'm very curious to hear how you think about this as an investor tackling the very pressing and urgent issue of climate change, but also in a space where um, it takes time to build these solutions. So, like, how do you think about that balance between patience and urgency, and maybe particularly in this space? And how do you help your founders think about that and reaching that equilibrium?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Caroline, the tribute is kind of like a tribute for my late father. Was about patience because he had patience for decades, sort of like keeping his head down and doing what was not his sort of calling, very obviously, but prepared him for his calling. And VC is also a decades long kind of affair, right? It takes a really long time to figure out if you're any good at this. And each individual companies, you can call it 7, 10, 13 years, also takes a really long time. And I think we all need to, and I think do, have a sense of urgency um, around big problems like climate change, but also our individual sort of contributions and achievements and accomplishments and so forth. And I think the tension between those two things, for me, I actually recently kind of developed this mental framework around that. So, I'll diverge for a minute, but I think it'll come back and sort of
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
coalescence. But basically, like when I was a kid, I really I had this dream that I'd be able to do. I used to ski a lot, like ski and do a 360 helicopter jump and land it, and I never got a chance to actually do that.
Mm,
And then as you get older, it's like, look, you don't go skiing as much. You're more prone to injury. You give up a lot of your dreams. It's just a natural progression of how things happen as you get older.
mhm,
But we were in Scotland dropping our kids off at summer camp, and we just outside Edinburgh, and we just happened to pop by this place that I saw a sign for like water park, and I went in, and there was this cable wakeboarding thing, which is like
mm,
interesting. So let me try that out, and I was able to just after a 45-minute session land a 180, and I realized, oh, this is interesting because you're landing in water, and because it's a cable, you don't have to sit and wait for a chairlift, and it takes like 45 minutes to get a couple jumps in. So anyways, I went back to Singapore. It ends up they have one of these things too. And after a few weeks of going, I was able to land this 360. And I swear, I was like so excited. I told Elaine, my wife, I was like, I'm happier than I've been in like 20 years. She's like, we, had, we got married and had 3 children in the last 20 years. I'm like, yeah, but this is different.
that's the
It
thing.
was so exhilarating. And, the thing that I realized there is that there was a point actually within that 3 week period where it's you're falling in water, but you can actually get injured too. Dislocated shoulders, also going pretty high speed. And I fell once and I pulled this muscle and I had to stop for about 5 days in the middle. And I realized that I'm impatient. Of course, I wanted to do that thing and I wanted to sort of progress optimally and most efficiently. But if you go a little too far um, in advance of where your capability is, then it leads to a huge setback and in the longer term,
Mhm,
far less efficacy and far less efficiency and actually much slower result of things.
mm,
You can see in the music, like if you're just practicing, anyone who's played an instrument will tell you, if you're practicing a passage, um, you give a young kid a passage and say, hey, practice this passage. 10 out of 10 of them, 100% of the time, they practice the wrong way. And it's because people are impatient, right? So
mhm,
the best practice, the way you need to practice is you take that thing, and if you know how to do it, part of the passage you can do at 100 BPM, and part of it you can do at 70 BPM. Everybody does 100, then does 70, and then they're just like, at the border of what they can do. But actually, what you should do, you should take it down to 60 and do it consistently and
mm,
groove that. And after you've done it maybe 20, 30 times or whatever it is, then you bring it up to 70. And after you groove that, then you bring it up to 80. It's kind of like, you know, um, if you have a river that's going consistently in the same direction over a long period of time with the same path, you get the freaking Grand Canyon, right? And that's what we're trying to do with our nervous system. We're trying to create this pathway. And if you mess up because you're doing part at 100, part at 70, whatever it is, then it's like you're moving the river around. You actually don't groove the thing. So
mm,
there is this optimal, like, be in a rush, but sometimes you need to like bring it back. There's this Navy SEAL saying that, you know, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Right? It's the same type of concept, but you're learning how to cock your gun and clean it, whatever. You don't go as fast as you can. You do it slow and you groove the motion, and then when you have that, you have the muscle memory, so you can do it faster and over long term. That's better. So if I relate that to what I see in founders' journeys, especially first-time founders, they're like, and I've been a first-time founder, so I had all this same mistakes, but like oftentimes I think it feels like running around like a chicken with your head cut off, right? And trying to practice this piece at the limits of our capability, sleeping 3-4 hours a night because the stakes are so high and you want so badly for this thing to be successful and your identity is wrapped up into it. But I feel like oftentimes that is not the most efficient and the fastest way to get to the success that they're trying to get to. And so, self-care is really important. That's why like mental health is such an issue with founders. I think finding that optimal groove and being really impatient in the long term might look like being a little bit more patient in the short term, but it's actually the same thing.
Mm. Really interesting. I love that analogy. Huh.
You're 10 years in now with Amasia, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Tell
10
us,
years ago.
tell us about 10 years. That's usually a sort of touchstone time on anything. And I think particularly in VC, what are kind of the biggest learnings of the first decade?
Well, like I said, there are, it takes a long time to figure out if you're any good at this. And it's really interesting because the type of investing that I was doing before, I was a trader before. And, literally
Got
the
a
first
scoreboard?
thing, yeah, it was derivatives. And we had a clicker, like you click and there's a new P&L. And it's like literally multiple times a second you can get a different number. So it's like we're, rats clicking the button for more, sugar or cocaine or whatever it is. We're just sitting there like constantly trying to get more feedback. So the feedback loop and that type of thing is very tight. And in VC, it's just not. There are a lot of intermediate steps, like you win a deal or you don't win a deal, but to see whether the deal, does well, it takes a really long time. So I'll qualify by saying that, learnings are based on sort of very intermittent and how do you say, kind of sparse data, I suppose, intermediate data. But, I think that the biggest thing for me is that VC and actually all business and really all of life is about people. The when you're investing early stage, yeah, it's important to know the market and have an idea that seems to address a big pain point and can be very big commercially and so on. But like time and time and time again, I've seen that founders just pivot, right? That business becomes something different than what they envision. But if it's a great team, then they're able to find their way through those pivots. And you can take a sort of a not great founder who is in the most amazing opportunity ever. That's generally going to be a little bit less of a successful outcome. So I guess it's a little cliche, but yeah, I think it's VC, as with all the business, I really do feel like it's the importance of people is so important. Yeah.
Tell us about it. It feels like, the last few years in the US, there's been a glut of new capital and new investors and new companies being founded in climate. Is that similar in Southeast Asia?
Okay, I would say that climate in Southeast Asia is okay. First of all, venture in Southeast Asia is a much newer ecosystem than venture in, let's say, the United States.
Yeah.
When we started out 10 years ago, it was a very early and very few firms that started up basically, and now there's been a proliferation of firms that have started there, and I think it tends to lag. Like the U.S. is sort of the center for innovation globally. I would say China being a pretty fast follower there, but the venture ecosystem in Southeast Asia has grown a lot. I'd say probably more, but from a lower base. Percentage terms it's grown more, but from a lower base. And I'd say the same thing is sort of happening with climate there. It's still early. There aren't a lot of investors that are dedicated on it. There are a couple, but not that many, not a ton of companies, but I think that's growing. And again, from a lower base, so probably in percentage terms, going to be in the next few years, probably a bigger space. When we think about investing in the region, they'll qualify this a little bit. The easiest sort of proven methodology to have good results is to see what has worked in other regions, usually US, sometimes China, and see which of those models will make sense to copy and paste into Southeast Asia. By the way, it's similar for India and so on, but in South America.
Mm-hmm.
But then also understand which of those models really make sense for a local champion to win. So I'll give you an example. In Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world, largest market in Southeast Asia, 250 million people, very, very young populations, and very social in nature. Like the amount of time they spend on social media is off the charts. So very digital economy. But if you think about the top search engine in Indonesia, it's not an Indonesian company, it's Google, because you can copy and paste Google and offer that very, very quickly. But if you want to talk about the top e-commerce company or the top ride-sharing company or the top payments company, these things deal with not just bits, but atoms and regulatory affairs, things that a US player can't come in and copy and paste very easily. So those are all local champions. So when we think about climate in Southeast Asia, I think there are certain opportunities around sort of deep tech. There's some great research coming out of places like NUS. But in general, it's a little less clear to me where the local advantage is. There are some certain pockets, but that's where we're trying to look. So I'll give you one example. Nature-based solutions is something that Southeast Asia has a huge advantage in because they have so much land and a lot of it, like incredible sort of heat land restoration potential, for instance, in Indonesia. And so, I think that's an area that is very unique and there should be defensibility around that. But yeah, all this to say, there's a lot of growth there. It's from a small base, it's still very early. But I see, good sort of headroom ahead for growth in particular niche areas.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that angle on the regenerative side of things. Could you say a little bit about, I know your climate focus is mostly on software, maybe that's too narrow a descriptor. Tell us about that as opposed to the deep tech side of the fence, that thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do focus on software and internet companies, so more the bits than the atoms. And the reason for that is if you look at sort of climate from emissions from 1800 till today, it's up by about 1,000x. A lot of people say, oh, it's because of people. We're like a cancer that's spreading around the world. And that's true. But population growth is worth about 8x of that 1,000x. Some people say we need more breakthrough technology. And, I think that's could be part of the solution. But if you look from 1800 till today, we've had a lot of breakthrough technology. And because of that breakthrough technology, actually our per unit cost emissions wise of everything that we make today is less than it's ever been, right? Every pen, every guitar, every mouse, everything. But what ends up happening as our per unit emissions goes down, the cost also goes down because we're more efficient at making it. And because of that, we tend to buy more units of everything. So our per capita emissions is going up. There's this thing called the Jevons paradox. So at the core of our thesis is this idea that the problem isn't a lack of technology. The problem isn't population growth entirely. In fact, the majority of the problem is just us. It's our behavior. And we need to change our behavior. That has to be part of the solution. I personally think that climate is just such a big problem. It requires as many people from as many different backgrounds and different perspectives to come together and try and solve it as possible for us to stand a chance at doing it. So I definitely don't say like, hey, this is the only approach. But I feel like it has to be part of the approach. And if you look at the landscape of climate funds out there, the overwhelming majority of them are focused on more capital intensive solutions. And frankly, a lot of that stuff is more sexy, like direct air carbon capture and plastic eating bacteria and all that stuff is like, it's sexy,
Cool.
but
Yeah, right.
that's cool. It's super cool, right?
Yeah.
But I think if that's the only thing, a lot of this stuff is very capital intensive. It takes a long time. You have to sort of use more electricity and generate more carbon than you're taking out of the air sometimes, and at least until you get to massive scale. And so again, I think all the approaches are important, and I support some of them. I sit on a board at UCLA of this institute called Institute for Carbon Management, and there we're focused on a lot of these more sort of capital intensive methodologies. So I support all that. I think it's important, but for us at Amasia, we tend to focus on more capital efficient software and internet companies. Um, yeah, and if you look at what has changed our behavior in the past, social networks and video games and all these things, they're very good at getting us to change our behavior. Sometimes for more negative outcomes, but what if we could use some of those best practices to help solve this problem? That's sort of the idea of where this thesis came from. And my partner Ramanan, he developed the thesis. I had a little bit of input, but he has a book out called In Our Hands, and the idea is like all the technology is actually already there. It's all in our hands. We just need to come together and apply it so that we can come together and fix the problem. So yeah, that's a little bit about our thesis and where it came from.
Very cool. How do you guide founders to think about maybe talent in general? And we also, particularly with our climate portfolio, run into fairly frequently this impotence matching process, right? Where a lot of people come to us and say, I want to work on climate, but they don't want to. They don't want to learn a new category, or they don't want to take a step back from a scale and seniority standpoint. How do you guide founders on sort of assessing talent in general or talent strategy, but also maybe how do you guide just folks in your network on how to think about, okay, if you want to go work on climate, I think now's a good moment for it. Here's why. What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I do think it's a good moment for it. I think that it's just sort of like the awareness and the consensus. I wouldn't say it's 100% consensus, but I mean, you got to be kind of fringe to deny that climate change exists now. I mean, I think that's a pretty fair statement to say. So more and more people are aware, more and more people feel like they want to do something about it. They feel some climate anxiety. I think also there's more of this awareness that it's not just about sitting here and feeling bad for ourselves, but the things that we can do, getting out of that and taking action. We have a media company called Peak Action that we invested in, and their sort of tagline is we're the opposite of doom scrolling, because a lot of climate doom scrolling historically has been people realizing that there's something I can do. And I think that's where the thought of like, hey, how do I get into this industry is coming for a lot of the folks that you're interacting with. So I think it's a great time. There are going to be more and more opportunities. And I would say, I've taken a lot of transitions in my career where I had to step laterally and kind of start again several times over. And for me, it's different for everyone. It's a very personal thing. But for me, I love the challenge and sort of the stimulation of trying something new. That's not for everybody. But the thing that I told myself each time is I can go try this out and learn something. And in the worst case, if I don't like it or it doesn't suit me or whatever it is, I can't prove myself that I'm worthy in this new industry or this new area. I can always come back to what I'm doing. Right? That's not going to be an issue. So, and funny enough, each time I haven't actually had to come back. Right? In fact, I never wanted to come back. And so I think that kind of heuristic has helped me to take a little bit more risk than I might have otherwise. Again, it's not for everybody, but if there's somebody that you're talking to who's on the fence of, oh, I really want to make the shift, but I don't know if I want to give up on seniority. I don't know. I think if you're sort of confident about yourself, whatever you get into, you're going to prove yourself and you're going to be success in it. And if that's the case, then go for it, take a leap. I'd also say, though, that you don't necessarily need to take a leap. For our companies, as an example, depends on your function, right? But for our companies, as an example, if you are a software company that is focused on enterprises and helping them to measure their carbon footprint, well, guess what? All of the same sort of job functions that a typical software company needs are relevant for this company too.
Yeah.
They need developers, they need product people, they need BD people, they need, everything. It's the same, marketing. And so I think there are opportunities out there where you don't necessarily need to take a step back or sort of a downgrade in pay or seniority. It just might take a little bit more thought than going out there and reading the headlines and just sending a quick email to the folks that you immediately hear about. All of our companies, because of our approach around this behavior change and the fact that it's more marketplaces and software and these types of things, we need folks that are just plain tech sort of people, talent. It's the same thing as if they weren't in climate. What we look for, though, is that they're really passionate about it. And, I think that that's something you can demonstrate even if you haven't had the experience, because it's pretty new, right? Not a lot of people have, 50 years in climate experience. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of opportunities out there for people to get involved, whether it's something new or not. And I'd also say that the other types of companies, which are a little bit more deep tech or capital intensive and so on, like, yeah, maybe a software developer is not going to be relevant, but if you're in sales or if you're in BD, the more business type functions, those are also relevant as well.
John, one question that I would have here, maybe this is just taking a step back, but now having spent 10 years doing what you're doing with Amasia and investing in climate companies, seeing a pretty broad range of them, I'm sure, how has that changed your worldview personally? And is there anything that you've come to see differently throughout that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is when we started, we weren't totally focused on climate. We've always been thesis driven, and we've always been sort of global or cross border. My partner Ramanan developed this thesis in 2018. I think we published in 2019. So it's been about 4 or 5 years. It's followed up the whole firm. So everything that we do now is with this lens. But I think that I've been, simultaneously like really discouraged and really encouraged at the same time. I mean, the problem, as we mentioned before, is like so big. And I get really frustrated, as I think a lot of people do, with folks in government and people saying they're going to do something, and then at the next COP they say that we're not going to do it or whatever, changes administration, all these things. But at the same time, these people ultimately work for us in most parts of the world, right? Citizens are the ones who vote these people in. And I think that groundswell and that unity has been really encouraging for me to see. So I think in general, I'm an optimist. So I believe we're going to get there. I believe we're going to figure this out. And we've had a lot of challenges throughout the course of human history, and we're still here. Life might look a little different. I think there'll be some adaptation involved. I don't think it's totally mitigation, but I think we're going to figure it out. And I think that a lot of that comes from the groundswell, folks on the ground doing what they can, and not sitting around waiting for their heads of state to go figure it out. Because if we're doing that, I think we're kind of
doomed. Yeah, really interesting. Well, this has been really interesting to hear more about your perspective. I think this conversation took a couple of layers deeper than I might have imagined, and I'm really happy that it did. It's been really great to learn more just about not only your work with Amasia, but also your personal story and how that has influenced all of the impact that you've driven this far. So really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and share more on your story. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Caroline. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, John. It's really fascinating to have you.